Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today it's all about Dirty Dancing. Now, the 80s were a really unique time for soundtracks which featured pop music, and this was a relatively new phenomenon in the 80s because in the so-called golden age of Hollywood, soundtracks to films were almost always instrumental unless they were musicals of the Rodgers and Hammerstein variety, which began as Broadway musicals. But generally, think of things like Miklos Rosa and his wonderful score to Ben-Hur. Think of Maurice Jarre and his wonderful scores to Dr. Zhivago and Lawrence of Arabia. These were instrumental, generally orchestral feats of music. And in the early days of the long-playing record, soundtracks, whether for films or for Broadway musicals, were the best-selling records because pop artists hadn't yet reached the understanding that in order to have a hit record, you cannot just have one or two good songs and the rest filler. You needed to fill side A and B of that LP with continuity. Frank Sinatra, who I think invented the concept album in my view, he was one of the first to get it. Now, by the late 60s, the nature of the film soundtrack gradually started to change, beginning with Easy Rider in 69. But it was really almost a decade later, in 1977, with Saturday Night Fever, that the soundtrack became something that sort of went from an exposition of orchestral and otherwise instrumental music to something that could be a place where a greatest hits pop album was synonymous with a soundtrack. That was certainly the case with Saturday Night Fever. Grease was another one. Think of Frankie Valli's Grease is the Word, written by the Bee Gees. And in the 80s, this absolutely exploded. And it meant several things. It meant that bands that were struggling to get major hits got huge exposure. Think Survivor, a band that should have always been far bigger than they were. James Petrick, a wonderful songwriter. He wrote Vehicle, I'm Your Vehicle, Baby, Back for the Ides of March. Just great, great band. But the Rocky films put them on the map. Think of Top Gun and Berlin, Take My Breath Away. And think of this soundtrack that we're talking about today, Dirty Dancing, because this soundtrack did something else. Not only did it take people that were kind of out of the limelight and shoot them back to the top, but it took people who were ostensibly from a different era and made them contemporary and relevant again. When I say people, I mean person. I mean the absolutely wonderful Bill Medley from the Righteous Brothers, a band that a group rather that most people associate with the early 60s. I mean, they tried to have a revival in the 70s, and with Rock and Roll Heaven, they kind of did. But when Bill Medley, who was one half of the Righteous Brothers, sung with Jennifer Warnes on the song "I've Had the Time of My Life," it really solidified the fact that a good song sung by a good singer will never go out of style and never has to be implicitly associated with one era over another. What a truly, truly wonderful song. And Jennifer Warnes was sort of the contemporary sort of king of 80s music. She also collaborated with Joe Cocker, a man who you could say whose career was given a much needed shot in the arm by his appearance with her on the soundtrack of An Officer and a Gentleman when they collaborated on the song Up Where We Belong. Hungry Eyes by Eric Carmen was another huge hit from this album. Now, Eric Carmen had some hits in the 80s, but again, he was someone that people probably mostly associate with the 70s. And look at Kenny Loggins, a creature of the 70s, but made the sound of the 80s thanks to his appearance on multiple soundtracks, including, of course, Top Gun. Now, this trend of pop music leading the way on soundtracks did continue for much of the 90s, but as the film industry began to contract throughout the 21st century, it became less and less common unless a musician was part of a film. Think Ice Cube. Of course, he's going to do his own music, his own soundtracks. Now, today we're sort of in a funny place where we have tech companies that are making a lot of the films, and in many cases, choices. Rather than having original orchestral music or original pop music, they'll just license pre-existing music. Now, when you do that, sometimes it can be very beneficial because it can artistically meld two previously distinct things and create an indelible piece of art as a consequence. In the film world, the people who did this most famously and the best were Stanley Kubrick and Martin Scorsese. Think the use of Richard Strauss, Aram Khachaturian, Georgi Ligeti, and Johann Strauss in 2001: A Space Odyssey by Kubrick. Think of the use of Beethoven's Ninth in A Clockwork Orange, and look at Scorsese. Look at the wonderful use of the second half of Layla in Goodfellas and all over Scorsese films. Look at Ford Coppola with Apocalypse Now and the use of the end by the doors. Wonderful. But others simply use it because they've made the calculation, the very economic calculation, that licensing pre-existing music for their purposes is less expensive than commissioning something new. So as always, it's a mixed bag. But in the 80s, they really got it right. Think of Sammy Hagar, First Times at Ridgemont High, Sammy Hagar again, heavy metal, Glenn Fry, on that soundtrack. So many soundtracks of the 80s, too many to mention, where the movie industry really went pop. And then we can also talk about how a lot of that not only was inspired by Saturday Night Fever of the 70s, but also by TV, Miami Vice, and licensing so much really unique pop, soul, rock, dance, new wave, every genre of music, all under the umbrella of the theme written by the wonderful Jan Hammer. So that's some food for thought for today. As always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.